Have you ever wondered what if Jesus was lying? Hello and welcome to our video series, The Historical Jesus, a video series where we investigate some of the most challenging, controversial, and fascinating questions ever asked about Jesus Christ. In the previous episode, we took a brief look at an important question. Did Jesus actually claim to be God? Today, we're tackling one of the most common objections raised against that claim. What if Jesus simply made it all up? For many skeptics, that sounds like a reasonable explanation. Maybe Jesus knew he wasn't God, but intentionally deceived people for influence, fame, power, or some greater cause. While others take a softer approach, they suggest that perhaps Jesus wasn't malicious, but genuinely believed that claiming to be divine would help people embrace his moral teachings and ultimately make the world a better place. But does that explanation really fit the person of Jesus? Does the evidence actually support the idea that Jesus was a liar? That's exactly what we're going to explore in today's episode. Let's start with something simple. Most liars lie for selfish reasons. People lie for money, for fame, for pleasure, for political power, for influence and control. But what exactly did Jesus gain by claiming to be God? He didn't become wealthy. He didn't rule nations. He didn't build a military empire. He didn't live in luxury. Instead, Jesus lived a humble life. He healed the sick, cared for the poor, defended the outcasts, claimed to be the Messiah, and constantly taught people to love God and love one another. And what did his claim ultimately bring him? Hatred, rejection, persecution, torture, and eventually crucifixion. So if Jesus knowingly lied about being God, what was the motive? That's the first major problem with the Jesus was a liar theory. There's another huge issue people often overlook. Jesus preached primarily to the Jews. Now, why does that matter? Because first century Jews were strict monotheists. They believed there was only one God, and they fiercely protected that belief. The Old Testament repeatedly emphasizes this. In Isaiah 42:8, God says, "I am the Lord. That is my name. I will not give my glory to another." And again in Isaiah 48:11, he says, "I will not yield my glory to another." So Jesus, being Jewish himself, knew these scriptures perfectly. So if he was inventing a false religion, why choose the worst possible audience? Why not go to Greece or Rome, where people already believed in divine men and multiple gods? Why preach among people who would consider his claims blasphemous? So that doesn't sound like a strategy of a calculated deceiver. All right, let's look at all of this from a moral perspective. Even many non-Christians admire Jesus as one of the greatest moral teachers in history. His teachings about love, forgiveness, humility, mercy, purity, and truth have transformed civilizations. But here's the problem. How does a deliberate liar produce the most morally beautiful life in history? Not only that, Jesus constantly taught honesty and condemned deception. In Matthew 19:18, Jesus says, "Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony." And later the Apostle Paul writes, "We do not use deception, nor do we distort the word of God." 2 Corinthians 4:2. And elsewhere, Paul says, "For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you." 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3. Now, think about the implications. If Jesus knowingly lied about being God while teaching others to tell the truth, then he wasn't simply mistaken. He would have been a massive hypocrite. And honestly, does that fit the Jesus we encounter in the Gospels? Think about it. Now, here's another question people rarely ask. If Jesus was merely a man falsely claiming to be God, did he not fear God himself? Remember, Jesus believed in the God of the Old Testament. He constantly prayed to the Father. So if he knowingly committed blasphemy by claiming divine authority and accepting worship, why wasn't he terrified of God's judgment? To falsely claim divinity while still believing in God would require unbelievable recklessness. In fact, Jesus would practically have to be an atheist to make such claims without fear. But you know what? Nothing about his life suggests atheism. In fact, it's quite the opposite. His entire life was centered on spirituality and obedience to the Father. Now let's talk about the disciples, because this creates another major problem for the liar theory. After Jesus' resurrection, the disciples suddenly transformed. Before the resurrection, they were fearful, confused, and scattered. But after the resurrection, they boldly proclaimed that Jesus had risen from the dead. And you know what? They suffered terribly for that belief. They were imprisoned, they were beaten, rejected, exiled, and many were eventually martyred. Now think about this. People can die for something they mistakenly believe is true, but people do not willingly suffer torture and death for something they know is a lie. If Jesus knowingly deceived his disciples, how do we explain their absolute conviction afterwards? How does a crucified fraud inspire that kind of loyalty? Think about it. Now at this point, some people try another explanation. Maybe Jesus lied for a good cause. Maybe he believed his moral teachings were so important that claiming divine authority would persuade people to follow him. But honestly, that explanation creates even more problems. If Jesus was truly noble, why use deception at all? Why not simply teach moral truth without falsely claiming to be God? And if his goal was to lead people to the true God of Israel, then claiming to be God would actually mislead people into worshipping the wrong person. And that would defeat the whole purpose. And remember, many of Jesus' moral teachings were already rooted in the Old Testament. They weren't so radically different that he needed to invent divine claims to make people listen. So why go as far as blasphemy? Why risk execution unnecessarily? And here's another important question. Where in history do we ever see someone inventing an outrageous lie, knowingly dying for it, and doing it purely for humanity's benefit? We have examples of people dying for beliefs they sincerely thought were true. But where is the historical precedent for someone knowingly fabricating divine claims and then willingly enduring torture and death for the deception they invented? This theory simply doesn't fit reality. At the end of the day, the Jesus was a liar theory creates far more problems than it actually solves. Someone who lived as Jesus lived, taught as Jesus taught, and died as Jesus died simply does not resemble a deceiver. The simplest and most reasonable conclusion is one the earliest Christians proclaimed from the very beginning, that Jesus truly believed his claims because they were true. And that leaves us with the far more serious question. If Jesus really claimed to be God, and if he is who he claimed to be, what are we going to do with him? What are you going to do with him? Think about it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others. God bless you.